Hi everyone, welcome. So to start this module in the course, right, we're going to talk in a very abstract sense, like why we need government in the first place, and talk about a number of problems that arise, in particular when we think about acting as a collective. And fundamentally, when we think about this course and this topic, um, and Professor Boucher may have a little bit different take than about some of this content, right? But when we're talking about politics, we're talking about the actions that people take and trying to understand how and why people behave the ways in which they do and how they behave in response to institutional and rule structures of governments. And so if we try to understand people, and a starting point is assume everyone is strategic, given particular rules, given a particular government, they're going to behave in ways that try to achieve their own interests. Um, and right, people have some goals, they work to achieve them. And therefore, we can think of most situations as games. They have known defined structures, and they're not all fun games. But understanding the government, right, is really about understanding how these games are played. And we need a few things for a game that we're going to be talking about throughout the course, throughout these particular collective action problems in this video, and throughout America's history. The first is we need to define who the players are, right? So who is competing for power, right? How they're pushing against or pulling against one another. The rules of the game, right? We'll talk about kind of the Constitution this week, right, as kind of the core rule book of our democracy, right? There's lots of other kind of institutions that are defined that set right what actions people can take and as well as the types of rewards and the other things they get from them. And finally, we need to understand players' preferences, right? So economists would call this a utility function, right? But we all have preferences over policies or other things that we may want the government to take care of and do, right? And similarly, politicians have their own preferences. And when we think about these three in tandem, right, you can go through any type of game and lay these out, right? Chess is a two-player game. You have specific moves you can make, right? And your preference, right, is to win, of course, right? Some of you may be playing board games at home, right? Monopoly is a game that can make you lose your friends and start a lot of fights, right? But it has these defined structures. Others, games, right, you have to kind of judge and weigh other people when playing poker, for example. Other games that may sound trivial, right? Deciding what you might want to eat, right? Dating and mate selection, right? But all of these are games, like the games being played by politicians in power in DC and in Sacramento and more locally, right? Whether it's with other politicians, whether it's politicians with the media in terms of trying to get their point across. And right, we actively participate in this by deciding whom to vote for and how to participate in our democracy. And if we start with a few assumptions about these three things, then we can start figuring out politics and where things go wrong, where they may go right, and how we can design institutions such that they function as best as possible. An important note, too, you don't have to like the preferences, the utility functions, right, that other people have. To put yourself in their shoes and think about the strategy and trying to understand why and how a particular actor may take a particular approach. So when we think about actions, when we think about how this all works, action in isolation is quite simple, actually, right? So if you want a burrito for lunch, go get a burrito safely, right? With practicing social distancing or ordering in, right? You want to go surfing, so go surfing, right? This is a very easy kind of choice to do. Again, although stay away from beaches, and stay away from other people. But what if there are multiple people? Right? A lot of problems begin to crop up and arise when we start thinking about how people might cooperate or get what they want in groups. Right? Depends quite importantly on how many people they are, right? Whether they have divergent preferences, right? So they have different goals in mind. Um, some scenarios where you have very limited choices, you've only got kind of the main two-party candidates to vote for, or you've got, right, a huge number of people to vote for. This can cause various issues. And also, right, if resources, so the time and money people have to put into government are unequal, right, we can come up with a number of issues here. And so collective action, right, is not as simple as it sounds, getting groups of people to do things together, right? Even if we have kind of can think of it as a well-defined game, right? You need some way to aggregate preferences, right? Whether equally or weighted, right? Using majority rule, right? There's lots of discussions of various issues where even if you have aggregated preferences, they may not be kind of clear interpretable. So there's Arrow's theorem where it introduces the concept of cycling over these options. right? Also, people's preferences may not be reconcilable with other. You can't necessarily compromise if people are completely at odds with one another, right? They may not even have well-defined individual preferences, right? If you ever ask someone where they want to go eat, right, they may not have a clear sense of this. And of course, right, there are some outcomes that people may want, people may seek in terms of, right, some goals, right? Everyone might want world peace, right? Everyone might want to fight the spread of coronavirus, but the actions to do so, people may disagree upon. So in this video, right, we're going to talk about some problems that arise from these issues. And in particular, there are four common collective action problems, right? And these are discussed in the posted reading for this week, right? It's a PDF from the first chapter of a book called The Logic of American Politics. Right? And so these four kind of collective action problems are everywhere in the course materials that we'll discuss, right? And many kind of scenarios are very much resemble these. The first type of collective action problem is one of coordination, right? And quite simply, if you think about it in a very simple way, when there's a lot of different options, right? There's thousands of various restaurants that we could go get food from. Where do you go, right? There's so many options, right, that we could choose from, and we would have to necessarily coordinate on one of these, right? The idea of protest and mass mobilization is a place where you may have a hard time coordinating, particularly, right, the modern era cell phones and kind of technologies help solve this coordination problem by figuring out when we're going to protest, how. A common coordination problem that occurred in 2016, right, is that many Republicans in kind of both elites and masses didn't necessarily want then candidate Trump as the Republican nominee, but they split their vote across Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, and other candidates, right? And so Trump ended up coming out of the fray with a plurality of votes because the rest of the Republican voters split their votes amongst these people. So when we talk about this coordination problem, right, there are a couple main components here. The first is there are too many kind of possible options, right? This is why it's often easier if you narrow down choices or other things for people. Also, people may not have clear preferences, right, around them across the various options, and no kind of credible way to signal to each other about when you might protest and when you might meet, or signal this particular kind of solution. So we can solve coordination problems, right, through communication and through these other things, right? But often there are many, many alternatives and they can come up all the time. A second type of collective action problem is what's known as the prisoner's dilemma, right? In its kind of canonical form, you can think of it, right, as an actual prisoner, right? Is that imagine you were arrested for a crime and so was someone you know. Your two actions, you can either confess or you can stay silent, right? If you both stay silent, you each get some minor sentence, right? Because the other one, neither of you have kind of ratted the other one out. Um, if you both confess, right, you each get a heftier sentence for whatever this kind of hypothetical crime might be. But there's an advantage, right? If you confess and your friend stays silent, right, you get out completely free, but your friend gets a massive penalty, right, a massive sentence. Right. And so if you think about the scenario of this game, kind of in an optimal way, kind of collectively, right, is you should both stay silent. You should both take a little small punishment, right, for, in terms of the collective weighting, if we weight all kind of the months in jail as equal. But most people would try to confess here to get away free, right? And in fact, the logic of the other person, your friend, right, should do the same thing too, right? Or they are incentivized to do this as well. And it means that both people confess, right? And you both get this hefty kind of 5-year sentence. The important bit about the prisoner's dilemma is not this abstract nature of the game or the exact payoffs, but even when there's kind of a collectively beneficial strategy available, many people don't always play it because of the individual incentives they have, right? In this case, to confess to try to get away free. And often there's no way to credibly commit to this, right? If you could both talk, right, it out and try to both agree to stay silent, you still might want to rat the other person out, right, to get away completely free. And this occurs in lots of places in politics, right? So wouldn't it be great, right, if both the Democrats and Republicans, right, didn't spend as much as they do on trying to get elected, right, every single campaign cycle, right, and gave it to charity or put it towards some worthwhile cause? But neither would, right? And you can't necessarily blame them, right? Because the logic of this, right, is exactly the similar to the prisoner's dilemma, right? Is that you know that if you don't spend the money, the other side will, right? And you're constantly trying to one up the other. A related type, right, to the prisoner's dilemma is the tragedy of the commons, right? And sometimes you can think of this as a special type of the prisoner's dilemma with many actors, right? So if one person does a particular action, it's not necessarily a big deal, right? But if everyone does it, it suddenly is. And if you look around, right, many of these examples are about kind of common pool resources, right? It's not that big of a deal if you litter, right? You shouldn't, of course. But if everyone does it, which many people do, it's a huge sanitation issue and a huge problem, right? In terms of natural resources, right, it's not that big of a deal if you go out and catch a ton of fish in your boat, but suddenly if every fisher is catching all the fish that they can, you start running out of fish, right? You're depleting the stocks in the ocean. Similar logic to hunting, similar logic to consuming many of these kind of common resources. Finally, the fourth type of collective action problem is what's known as the free rider problem. And this may be somewhat familiar to you, particularly if you've ever done group work in class, right? Is that some people get the credit that the rest of the group gets while contributing significantly less work. Um, and in particular, there are lots of examples of this where people can free ride, right, on the work, on the efforts that other people have put in. So, for example, with respect to vaccines, right, is even if you're not individually vaccinated, right, the fact that other people are, that there's so-called herd immunity and other things, you benefit from it, right? So the individual incentive is maybe less strong to go get vaccinated because you're getting the benefits of everyone else's effort. People free ride, right, on the fact that other people will go vote and they don't necessarily have to, right? And this means that it can be hard to mobilize people to show up and actually cast their ballot because they may just free ride on the efforts of others. Similarly, right, for charity or kind of public service things like PBS or NPR, other public broadcasting, right, is that you free ride, you get the collective benefit, even if you don't actually donate to these particular resources. And so our government has lots of various tools to help solve these collective action problems, right? Including, right, why do you think paying taxes is mandatory, right? Is because if you could get the benefits of government without paying in, that would be ideal, right? So the government solves this problem, this free rider problem, by making you pay. Right? And so when we think about how we solve these collective action problems, right, there's these four particular types we've discussed in this video, right? And the way we solve them is by designing a government to do so. And in particular, the solution that our government provides, right, are rules, or we could also call them institutions, right? Any organization, whether it's a government, whether it's US or another government, a firm, right, a particular group, they have rules to kind of govern how action will be taken within it. And one of the things that's kind of important to keep in the back of your mind is we don't just get these rules magically appearing in front of us, right? The way the government, right, our constitution is structured, they don't just appear out of nowhere. Right? People made them because of the incentives they had at the particular time, right, to benefit themselves or to benefit the common good. And so when we talk about institutions, right, they help solve these, but there are endless options, right, for how we could structure our government, structure the tools, and structure particular relations between branches. And so at first pass, if you're thinking about how you might dream up a government, um, you could say something like, well, let's make the institutions good. But like, what is good, right? Does that mean efficient? Does that mean optimal for everyone, right? Where everyone is getting something they particularly want? Or is it about making the government or allowing the government to act quickly in times of crisis like we're in now? Right? So we need to think about the trade-offs that come with structuring government in particular ways. In the first, we can kind of think of two types of costs that we might pay with any government structure, kind of at each end. The first are what are discussed as transaction costs, right? And so we pay transaction costs with the time and effort, right? When we compare preferences, negotiate compromise, right? And set all this up. So Congress, right, often has a very high transaction cost because it takes forever to get things done, right? There's lots of debate and lots of roadblocks to getting policy passed, right? And so there's very high transaction costs because it takes a lot of time and effort, right, to negotiate some common set of policies or other things that are close to what people want. On the other end, you can think of conformity costs. And conformity costs are the costs that you pay, right? They're the difference between what someone would prefer, right, and what the collective action, kind of collective decision, excuse me, actually results in. So if you get some output of government that you really don't like, that's very different than what you like, right, you're paying high conformity costs here, right? And so we can think about solving, right, any choice, any collective action decision, right, in ways in which the transaction costs may be high and the conformity costs lower, right, because the more time and effort you spend brokering compromise, right, the more amenable it'll be to people, right? And similarly, you may have very high conformity costs if you act quickly by, for example, just having someone say and decree what the decision is going to be. Right, so if you had to imagine we were facing this choice, right, a very hard kind of government shaking choice in front of us as to whether we get a burrito or some burgers for lunch, right? How could we do this as, right, a 250 or 400 person class, right? Well, we could all debate it. We could post on Canvas and the discussion forums and talk at length and kind of come up with some voting scheme, right? It would take a while. It would take some effort to organize that. And eventually we would get some collective decision about where we're going to go. Or I can just say we're getting burritos. Very quick, very efficient, right? And suddenly it's done. But that may be, right, very distant from what many of you want, right? Whereas the more amenable decision, maybe if we all got what we wanted and came to some common place, right, or aid are on our own terms. So when we think about the institutions we might design that are in, right, our constitution and in, right, our kind of federal structure and many state constitutions, we can think about how these costs vary across the types of institutions you might design. So on one end, right, not what the US is, you can imagine a dictatorship or a totalitarian regime, right, where one person, right, essentially decrees what the government policy will be and what things will be like. This is very low transaction costs, right? It's one person just says what it is. They don't have to debate it. They don't have to broker compromise. But, right, they may have the wishes that are against what many people want, right? The conformity costs will be extraordinarily high in this scenario. On the other end, I mean, if you think back to not a representative democracy like we're to talk about that is kind of present in the US, but a direct democracy where every single person voted on all policies before a particular government, right? This would be a nightmare in terms of transaction costs. It would take forever to get anything done, right? It would be extraordinarily high transaction costs. But the compromise we might get out of it, right, would have exceedingly low conformity costs, right? Because everyone would get to kind of have a say and participate in this. Right? And so, right, when we think about the institutional rules in the Constitution, right, and the Articles of Confederation before it, right, different rules and different institutions kind of solve these collective action problems in different ways, or they fail to solve them, right, and governments crumble. So with that, look forward to talking with you in kind of the next part of this module.